So good morning, everyone, and thank you for being here. I know everyone was very briefly introduced, mainly in terms of the geography each of us represented, but I would also like to briefly talk about the work that each of them. Ranjit also has his passport, so he is really from India. Yes. So Aditi, to my right here, is a poet, writer, and artist based in Delhi. And her poems have appeared in the Red Hen Anthology of Contemporary Indian Writing, a map called Home, Delhi, an anthology of women poets of Delhi, and numerous journals. Um, she co-edited Poems and Other Myths, a collection of spoken word poetry by women from Asia. Currently, she's co-editing an anthology of queer poetry from South Asia with Akhil Khatiyal. I'm particularly interested in that one, especially in the discussion for today. Alvin Pang is an author, poet, and translator and essayist whose writing has been published worldwide in more than 20 languages, including Swedish, Macedonian, Croatian, and Slovene. And he's a fellow of the Iowa International Writing Program and a board member of the International Poetry Studies Institute, and has appeared in the Oxford Companion to Modern Poetry in English and the Penguin Book of the Prose Poem. He was Singapore's Young Artist of the Year in 2005, and he has also been conferred with numerous awards. David Hurd is a poet, critic, teacher, and activist. He has given readings and lectures in Australia, Belgium, Canada, France, the US, and the UK. His poems, essays, and reviews have been widely published in magazines, journals, and newspapers. His collections of poetry include Through, All Just, and Outwith. His writings on the politics of human movement have appeared in the Los Angeles Review of Books and other publications. He is professor of modern literature at the University of Kent and a co-organizer of Refugee Tales, something which is highly relevant to the discussion today and which we'll talk about. Ranjit Hoskote was his most recent poetry collection, which is available in the bookstore, and of course, all our books are available in the bookstore, so please buy them, is Jonah Whale. His other volumes of poetry include The Sleepwalkers, Vanishing Acts, New and Selected Poems, and Central Time. He was a fellow of the International Writing Program, University of Iowa, and he's been writer in residence at Villa Waldbetter, Munich, Theater der Welt, Essen, Mülheim, and so on and so forth. So I think that gives all of you a sense of the kind of cultures and geographies and politics that their works have traversed. So let's begin by talking about the purpose served by both poetry and politics. Do they both bring about change? Are they both persuasive in nature? Do they influence and create movements in society? Maybe David, would you like to begin?
Thank you very much. I'm not so. It's not clear to me that poetry, in and of itself, produces change, much as we might wish that it could. I mean, there are certainly many poets whose work I admire, which have a politics, and I would prefer that politics to the politics that I'm currently inhabiting in the UK. So that's clear. I don't believe that the poem, by being a brilliant utterance on a political question, will alter the political question. But I do really think that because politics is so deeply embedded in language, that poetry is a really exacting and important way of thinking about political questions. And I'm particularly interested in poetry that is doing its politics in other ways. So there is activism, and then there is poetic thinking about activism, and you can't say that it's the poetry that is affecting the change, but it's part of the enterprise that is affecting the change, I guess. So
sure. Especially the bit about the language, that is something that I'd like to revisit later in the discussion. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Alvin.
Who was it who said politics is the art of the possible? You might say poetry is the possibilities of art, but silly, clever thing to say. But I think of poetry and literature in general as playing the long game. The influence what it seeks to exert, if done well, is not in the short term, but perhaps in the long term. So you measure it perhaps in impact over time. The people who might benefit from the particular ideas, perspectives, mindsets, and worldviews that are sort of encapsulated or encoded in good writing might actually be the ones several generations down the road. Now, in the immediate here and now of what we are doing, it can, of course, exert an influence. Poetry has been used as protest, as statement. There are all kinds of immediate reasons for a particular piece of writing or poetry to be uttered. And it, of course, plays a very important role in representing voices that are very often left out of the mainstream narrative or the media and so on and so forth. So it has that particular role. But really, I think the focus is, it's a long-term investment, to use the word of the economy. And the impact might be on a very individual level, but it takes, votes are individual. Actions are taken at the individual level. The arc of history is made out of individual choices, and these choices are mediated by philosophies and perspectives, mindsets, which good writing, good art, good poetry can have a subtle influence on. And we probably can't easily unpack the way in which the things we have read have had an influence on our life choices, but undoubtedly they do make a difference. And I think that's the kind of political influence good writing can have.
Great. Yes, Aditi.
Going with what David said, a poem in itself, I don't know if it's strong enough to just, to inspire change in the reader, or otherwise. But certainly I think poetry helps charge up the atmosphere, like you already touched upon, especially in, protest movements and other, other kinds of, political movements. That if you're already motivated or you're already thinking about something and a poem comes to you then, or it strikes you then I think it has a ripple effect. So if you're all, poetry probably doesn't move the unmotivated. You're already somewhere there. And then I think, it fuels things up. And I think that's the role of poetry for me. That's the kind of inspiration that I think poetry, lends to politics and movements.
Ranjit, how would you like to?
I agree. I think that, and this is a question I face in my life as a poet, but also in my life as a curator of the visual arts. You're always faced with this suspicion that people have of you. They say, what does poetry do anyway? What do the arts do? And I keep thinking that as a kind of provisional answer, we should remind ourselves that Plato was very suspicious of the poet in the Republic. He did not want the poet to be part of the Republic, part of a polity. And there's a reason for that. Whilst poetry may not always make things happen, it certainly helps transform consciousness, transform our attitudes to questions. And it thus becomes part of, as you said, David, a part of a larger set of enterprises that oppose what politics unfortunately tends to do, which is to occlude and to conceal. So there is a way in which poetry can have a revelatory purpose. I mean, I use purpose in a kind of vexed sort of way. And it's not given to all of us to be Faiz Ahmed Faiz, who was amazing poem, Hum Dekhenge, could serve as a slogan. Yeah, that happens to very few poets. But the danger that some of us face is that we turn our poetry into sloganeering in political causes, and I think that's a danger. I think there are internal hazards that we need to be attentive to as poets. It's very tempting to leap out and play some role in the public sphere, but there are costs to be paid in terms of the internal logic of your poetry. I think that's as important as needing to play this public role.
Sure. Now, we talked about activism, we talked about protest poetry, political poetry. So what about the politics of poetry itself, the act of writing poetry? My question would be, do we have politics in poetry? Because I know for certain there is no poetry in politics.
I do feel there's poetry in politics as well. Because largely for me as a poet, I think what I notice and observe on the outside is what inspires the poetry that I write about. Rather, my question is slightly unpacking the word politics here. Is what qualifies as politics, or what qualifies as political poetry then? Is it only when I'm consciously writing about a certain issue does that poem become a political poem, or is all poetry political then? The phrase we've always heard is the personal is political. But where I'm coming from, I'm thinking largely as, the political is more personal, and the personal becomes intersectional, and which is how probably, I look at the at poetry through that lens. That it's when I speak about, I primarily write a lot of love poems. So if I'm writing love poetry, is that political at all? Is there any politics to that? But probably my location, in the country I am, my location as a woman, my location as a queer person, that sort of qualifies, the politics of what I am trying to write. So a simple love poem can also be a politically charged poem. And I feel, largely just this, that we take political poetry very, as something else. That's something I sit down to write. I'm writing about the government, I'm writing a critique of XYZ, I'm speaking about a certain movement. But I think as poets, I don't know how many of us sit down and think that today I will write a poem about, this or that.
So let me jump in. Now, we've somehow been sort of accustomed recently to dividing spheres of intellectual activity as if they were naturally separate. We divide poetry from politics as if they are meant and were always meant to be separate spheres. I don't think that's necessarily been the case in history. You're thinking about so many cultures and societies where, for example, Tang Dynasty China, where most of the well-known poets were also the scholar administrators governing provinces. And the idea of being a learned or well-rounded person, being the best candidate to also be involved in politics was the understanding. Today, we seem to have reached a point where political economy is a technocratic enterprise, and therefore sort of drawn away from the activities we consider arts and culture and poetry and so on. What this sort of obscures is the idea that human needs have, I think, largely been universal. We aspire to the aesthetic, we aspire to reduce suffering, we aspire to seek pleasure and wealth and growth and things like that. And there are inevitably trade-offs. How we negotiate these trade-offs together as a community, we do that in a variety of ways, of which politics has become one of the tools, as it were. But the arts and poetry serve needs as well. And if we downplay those needs, that's at our peril. So there's a sense in which we need to build back some of these human concerns and needs into the way we govern ourselves and look after our own needs on a broader scale. So I would actually like to see, to use it as a shorthand for a range of humanistic ideals, I would like to see poetry return to the practice of politics on a more holistic level.
Yeah, I agree with a great deal of that. So it is clear to me, as Alvin is saying, that poetry has been kind of obliged or required to occupy a kind of a small corner of the intellectual economy. It goes back to the Plato point. I mean, it's not so there isn't a ruler king telling poetry what it is that it can and can't say, but there is an intellectual economy and an economy positioning poetry in such a way that it isn't obvious that poetry can speak to these wider questions, and so poetry is required to kind of contemplate its own procedures and practices. Important craft. I mean, these are not unimportant considerations. But I mean, so in the context that I'm working in at the moment, in the UK and UK's relations to Europe, the key questions in the politics are how space is understood, how space and territory and people's relation to space is understood, and what kind of relations people are allowed to have within that space and across that space. it seems perfectly obvious to me that poetry is a commentary on these questions. And some of my very favourite poets are people who've invested deeply in considerations of what it means to kind of reimagine the space in order that different kind of relationships become possible. So at that point, then poetry is precisely addressing a kind of question that politics is addressing, and politics doesn't want to hear what poetry has to say. And we'll probably, one should not be under any illusion that not hearing will continue, but also that saying will continue, and there will be then the kind of influences that we've been talking about a moment ago.
Now, what about the language that we all write in? And does that influence the power and the politics of poetry? We talked about poetry being positioned in the intellectual economy and it perhaps not, being in the largest world out there. The politics of language, does that influence this particular process? Does it lend poetry with more power? I think this time, Ranjit, we'll begin with you.
Actually, I'd link both of these questions, the question of politics and the question of language, because to me, some of the most profound questions of craft are already deeply political. And when I think, for instance, of questions of voice, that is a trope with which I have many problems. I'm troubled by that idea that you need to develop a certain kind of poetic voice. How do you work with the tradition? What forms do you use? And in the kind of poetry that I've been working on in the last few years, I'm actually questioning what to many of us was part of the received tradition, which is a certain kind of English personal lyric, if you will. And how does that become increasingly self-serving, self-absorbed, inward-looking, and unresponsive to the urgencies and turbulences of the world? So to me, it's very important to break this up. And rather than aim for this sovereign individual voice that seems to come from an Enlightenment tradition, you also look at the politics that undergirded that sovereign individual voice. It comes from a period when people were either being deported or losing land, commons were being lost to the enclosures. It comes from a time when people were being dispossessed. And it's very strange. The way we are taught English literature, you often think of the romantic lyric as some wonderful thing that falls from heaven. It doesn't fall from heaven at all. It comes from this troubled political landscape. And it's part of a proletarian enterprise that reduces and diminishes people as human beings. So how can I, in my poem, break that open? How do I, rather than insisting on my own voice, create a more oratorio-like poem, a more choral poem? And in an Indian context, to me, how do I, as someone who's effectively multilingual, but for historical reasons choose to write in poetry, write in English, how might the English I write, without in any way being, comically Indian English, how do I open myself up to Avadhi or to other kinds of art, to the Thumri, for instance, to musical cadence? How do I bring these textures into my poetry? So to me, these are questions that have to do with poetics, but they're also already very vital political questions that involve me in political choices.
Right. Yes. Yeah. Is it okay if I come back to you? No problem. Because when we talk about dispossession, I wanted David to talk about Refugee Tales because I think that would be relevant. Your work with the Refugee Tales and what it is and where we are currently with that.
Okay. Well, we're still in a moment of dispossession and deportation, and that's what. And so the Refugee Tales project is an attempt to respond to that in the UK. This is the point at which I become sloganeering, so I apologise. I apologise for that. But the UK is the only country in Europe that detains people indefinitely under immigration rules. Okay, so a person in the UK who seeks asylum, having fled somewhere else where they had great difficulty, comes to the UK, and they can be detained indefinitely. Where that might mean days or weeks, but it might mean months, and it might mean years. The longest period a person has been detained indefinitely in the UK is 9 years, just abandoned in a prison somewhere. Okay, so this is a great concern. It's also although it's become reported on, it is now reported on. It wasn't reported on much when our project Refugee Tales started 5 years ago. Refugee Tales, it does two things. It's a walk in solidarity with refugees, asylum seekers, and detainees. So every summer we go on a long walk, but in between times we go on long walks, and we're walking with people who have experienced detention, so the opposite of a kind of free relation to space. And as we walk, we share the tales of people who have experienced detention. So it is a project with a poetics, because precisely it's very interesting on the question of lyric. Actually, I entirely agree that the lyric that we were all required to inherit was a lyric which understood itself as a kind of sovereign voice. But it's not absolutely obvious that lyric has to be that. And lyric is a vulnerable, fragile, kind of multi-directional address which recognizes the need to produce communities in specific circumstances. And also, lyric, if it's functioning well, ought always to be recognizing the other voice and ought always to have a kind of polyphony built into it. So Refugee Tales is trying to be a kind of a polyvocal, polyphonic space in which voices that are very, very actively excluded from the language by all the forces of the polis, they have a kind of space. It's, in one way, it's symbolic, it's only symbolic because it's a walk. In another way, it has a very real kind of community-making function, I think. That's probably enough. And sorry for sloganeering at that point, but...
No, that's very interesting. Alvin, please.
No, I was just thinking about an example of how it can happen on an individual level. And the idea of even writing in English. I mean, to what extent do we take into account the fact that English, as it is practiced worldwide, I mean, has become a whole family of English says. You know, the way it is practiced, even in India, there's a diversity of that. And obviously, if you come into Southeast Asia, Singapore, Africa, and so on, you're talking about a whole range of different variations of the language that have been colored by their use in different parts of the world. Even in that one main language, do we see that variation play out? Do we give ourselves space to listen to the different ways in which English represents and speaks for the contexts in which it is practiced? Because using it in our own way, claiming it as our own, means we can use it to speak about our concerns and what we care about, and that's where it comes into political relevance. Classic example is Singaporean English.
Yes. So, Alvin, would it be okay if you read a small excerpt? Because I think there's a poem where you use Singaporean English a lot.
Do you want me to do that?
That would be great. I think the audience would love it. Yeah, please, go ahead.
Can I borrow your copy of...
Sure.
Sorry, I wasn't planning to read.
It's out there.
Yeah. So I'll give a bit of background. So in Singapore, Singaporean English, which is the sort of version of English we speak on the streets and at home, is colored by all the different sort of languages and cultures that make up Singapore. So there's a bit of Chinese in there, a bit of Malay, a bit of the local South Indian languages that make up Singaporean community. But officially, the government does not allow Singlish in national broadcasts, in the newspapers, and so on. It's effectively, it's not exactly a ban, but it's frowned upon, right? And there is actually a Speak Good English movement in Singapore to encourage people in Singapore to speak properly. And if you go to the website, they'll teach you how to pronounce important English words properly. Words like croissant and baguette and espresso and pizza. I'm not kidding. I'm not making this up. Meanwhile, of course, we artists and writers have continued to try and play with these textures in our writing. So I'll just give you a quick example.
I don't think you'll ever find French toast in France, for instance.
Yeah,
French toast is entirely Indian.
No, it's again, it's that technocratic approach to politics, right? The idea is, why must we speak proper, neutral, whatever that means, English? Because if they don't, then, businessmen coming to Singapore will not understand us and they'll go away and, bring their business to China or whatever the case might be. And then we'll be in trouble and we will die. Well, fine if we die. This particular piece is written in Singlish, which is what we would speak at home. And it's actually based on a real life story, if you allow me to share this. And it's based on my father's childhood. Now, when he was young, he couldn't afford electric lights in the house. This was 1950s after World War II. And so he told me he used to steal candles from the nearby church in order to be able to study. And I imagine him as a young boy talking to his elder brother, who's my uncle, of course, about this. And in here, you'll hear a bit of the textures of the Singlish that we use. And I suspect some political points will show up. And the interesting thing about this is, despite my government's concerns, I've read this all around the world, in Europe and so on. Nobody seems to have a problem getting it. And everyone laughs at the jokes at the expense of the government. See if you'll do the same. Okay, if I may.
Please.
Yeah. So, candles. Oi, Appa know you take candle from the church again, you're going to get it. Never mind, I bring them back when you study finish. You don't say he won't know. So dark, how to read, how to study. I got moon tonight, can see a bit. Our Leong house got light. I use mirror, borrow a bit of light, good enough. Candle you bring back. I don't want to get scolding because of you. I bring all the way home, you ask me to bring back for what? Anyway, tonight, Good Friday church got so many candles. They where got notice 9 less. Notice, don't notice, also wrong. You bring them back. Don't want. Go now, late already. Wait, Appa come home, you die. Don't want. Wait, the sisters see me bring back so many candles. They know I took them. I just say you giving them to baby Jesus lah. You're so stupid. Baby Jesus is Christmas lah. Good Friday is dead Jesus. Anything lah. I not go church one, how I know this kind of thing. You just bring them back there, okay? Appa always say, people must be honest. Cannot cheat, cannot steal, cannot lie. Appa say that, but you also lie what? Last week, health inspector come, he also lie, say our house very clean. Actually, he hide 2 dead cockroach under one shoe. That was different. That was government. Lie to government don't count because they don't care whether you're good or bad. They just want money for license. No license, we die. They where got care. Then Jesus also like government what? He where got care whether you go blind or not, house got light or not. He just hang up there all day for people to see, put the money in the box, give him so many candles for nothing. And then he also not taking exam. I borrow some candles to study, why cannot? Up to you lah. Say so much also no use one. You better go study before Appa come home. You say so much, I hungry already. I go downstairs, buy me from fat girl, you want? Don't want, I full. I must see you eat some more, she scold you. Eat and eat, so fat and stubborn like pig. Wait, you don't study, fail exam, then you know. You so fat and stubborn, next time can do what? I can be driver like Appa. Or sell meat like Ah Leong. Or gangster like Ah Sun. Then government come ask for money, I call my gang, beat them up. Anyone bully you, I beat them up. Siao lah you, gangster. Get injured how? Head kena parang, chop one big hole how? Then you better quickly study and become doctor lah. Then if I need hospital, you can cure me. Then Apo cough also can cure. Then you make a lot of money, then got light in the house. Then don't need to borrow candle from Jesus anymore. Thank you.
That was very good, La. That is very good. Okay, so I think that really kind of substantiated and threw some light on what we were talking about, the politicizing of language. Aditi, in the context of your work with queer poetry and the anthology that you're editing now, what about the politics of gender and the politics of language when it comes to the voice?
Sure. A lot of the work that I do with Bring Back the Poets is with really young, young poets who are still in school or in colleges. Where just speaking about what you were speaking about is about the question of voice. There, I think what I have learned from the workshops in schools and colleges is that instead of discussing more about what is a poem and what to write about and how to go about writing that, what the workshops taught me was that it's very important to just leave that conversation completely aside and allow young poets to explore the language that they want to write in. My work is largely around spoken word poetry, which is allowing this issue to be tackled in a manner that young people do want to. So the politics of their personal lives, what happens at home, conversations with our fathers and mothers, these are the primary preoccupations. What happens at school? So an 8-year-old writing a poem about what happens at school can be a very deeply political poem. His or her understanding of the language that qualifies as the language of poetry, the poetic voice, etc. Because that poem could be about bullying, it could be about the education system, it could be about anything else. And that's the language that I find myself most interested in. Anybody who's writing from the margins, poets already are on the margins of the literary word, but the people who are writing from the margins, for them the issue of language is an issue I think about, can I speak, before the question can become, how do I speak or what can I speak about?
Yes. Now talking of cultural crossroads, I think it's a given that literature has always built bridges across cultures and geographies and so on. But take a poem like Daffodils. I'm sure most of you have read it at some point. Now, as a child, when I read that, I always wondered what this exotic sounding flower was. But I kind of imagined it would be something pretty. Now, cultural images like this, I mean, in my poems, for instance, I've referred to chamandi, which is chutney in Malayalam. Cultural images like this, are they blocks or are they bridges?
I'm blocked by that question, which is in perfectly normal English. Which is, I think, I'm going to make a point I've made to many people. It might have been a block in the past, but in this day and age where everyone has Google Translate on their smartphones, there is no bloody excuse, pardon my French. If you don't know a particular term of a word that shows up in a novel that's otherwise in a language you understand, like English, look it up. I've had novels in Singapore, footnote sari. I mean, come on. What are you going to footnote next? Do we footnote, sorry David, do we footnote toad in the hole, which is an English dish, or etc., etc. Do we one day, in history textbooks footnote Brexit? Right? Everything is contextual. We understand that, and if we want to live in a globalized world that recognizes differences, we've got to essentially respect the fact that there will be things we don't necessarily know, and it is our responsibility as readers to go and find it out.
Yes, David, from the land of daffodils.
Yeah, and Toad in the Hole, apparently.
Toad in the Hole. I didn't say that.
I'm unfamiliar with both Daffodils and Toad in the Hole, I have to say. So I guess this is I think we need a long time on this, but I'll be brief. I reference trees and flowers and birds in my poems sometimes, but I'm not expert in any of those areas. And you could press me on the particular quality or nature of one of those items, and I would struggle. What I think that I'm doing is that these become part of the fabric of the language, and they do and they don't have that degree of cultural specificity that might become a block. Okay, they're part of the fabric of the language. But I think, but there, there's always the possibility that any kind of referent might be exclusive to another person. Then there's the question of how the poem addresses itself, and I think that if the poem has a sufficiently open address, then one way or another, the reader is going to think that it's possible to work out or have an inclination to work out what those references is. It's if the poem really doesn't have that kind of openness of address, then the references become blocks, I think.
Totally. Ranjit?
I might go off on one of my usual hobby horses here, because I think that poem is actually a unique missed opportunity in education system, because I think we all grew up with it in one way or another. And it was always and there must be teachers here who I'm about to offend brutally with what I'm going to say, but it's always taught, poetry tends to be taught in the most dismal way, even in the best places. And that Wordsworth poem was always pulled out to represent some obscure notion of inspiration and solitude. Those are motifs in the poem, of course, or nature, whatever this might mean. Sometimes one thinks that we'd be much better off if we had a notion of the ecology that didn't have this romantic notion of nature imposed on it. But if we had the kind of pedagogy that unpacked that poem, if it looked at the ways in which the poem is not only about a romantic theory of inspiration, but that it had to do with emerging discourses of tourism and heritage, if it looked at questions of, as we were saying earlier, it's the same logic of dispossession, the enclosures, the Industrial Revolution that creates a poem like this. What is it that you're not seeing in that idyllic landscape? What is happening while the poet wanders as lonely as a cloud? The cloud is seeing things. The cloud is seeing the kinds of things that Turner saw and indicated in his paintings. Why is it that we can't expand our pedagogy to let poetry breathe as part of a larger set of social, and to respond to your first question, to see poetry as something that has always been strongly linked to other kinds of social and political and cultural urgencies?
Sorry, just to intervene. You would address that question partly just by looking at some of the other lyrical ballads, wouldn't you? So that's not the poem where one finds social exclusion, but you only have to step to one side, and you're precisely addressing social exclusion. So there's a failing pedagogy, but the failure of that pedagogy is in the selection of the poem in the first instance, isn't it? Yeah.
Also speaks to problems of canon formation and anthology making. So it's one of the few poems that people, certainly at Indian schools, it is a clutch of Wordsworth poems that you read, but you do not read the context that they emerge from.
And then it also speaks to precisely the question we were raising earlier, which is what the function of poetry is in the intellectual economy. So the poem is allowed to speak to daffodils, but it's not allowed to speak to dispossession, for instance. Yeah.
Interesting you should talk about canon formation, because I'd like to kind of conclude our discussion with this question. When we talk about representation, let's say an international anthology of poetry or an international festival of poetry, are the voices that we come across in these festivals, in these anthologies, fairly represented? You were not listening.
There are when me and Akhil, we started the project of putting this anthology together, that was the primary question. The good way of putting an anthology together is to email all your friends and get the right poems for them, and the book hopefully will sell. The not so good way of putting an anthology together is to send out a call and hope that you can reach out to as many people, because with this particular anthology we are trying to gather poems from across South Asia and also South Asians who are living elsewhere. We're also trying to gather poems not primarily in English, which is a big challenge, and which is why the call had to be translated in all languages that we were ready to receive. The third angle for this was that what qualifies as queer and who can send in a poem, because the most frequent message I received was, I am a straight man but I write about XYZ, I'm not gay, but this poem is about gender or it's about sexuality. Is that poem then whatever a queer poem means? Yeah, right? So, there are so many different words for different gender and sexual identities. How do I ensure that the call is able to summarize all of it? Because the minute you don't mention, the minute That's the minute you exclude. So there were lots of these issues, and I don't know if this anthology in itself will be able to represent what we wanted to do, but just the entire act of putting it together, I think, is a good project in itself.
Right. Just a quick time check. We do have time for questions, right? Yes. Okay. Yeah. So we'll just answer this and then we'll move on to that. Yeah. Yes, Alvin.
I was
yeah.
listening because you're talking
No,
about
I was
representation.
just pulling your legs.
I know.
Yes.
So we're in a very interesting transitional stage right now. Right now, we still have the gatekeepers, right? The people who put together anthologies, the university professors and institutional holders who curate and, inevitably, because of their own personal tastes and so on, limit what gets represented, what shows up in festivals, what shows up abroad, what shows up on websites, what shows up in journals, so on and so forth. But at the same time, you also have the internet playing a tremendously important role. Today, if I come across a name I don't know, if I'm interested to know who are the contemporary voices in Indian poetry, I can look it up. And it is at least a huge leap forward compared to what was possible when you were limited by what your school teachers told you or professors told you was out there, or what your libraries choose to buy, what your bookstores choose to stock. We know our books don't reach each other. It's a long-standing thing. I have so many fine Indian poet friends. I can't get their books except when I come here, which is why I love coming here and overloading my luggage. But I can still keep in touch with what's happening to a certain degree if I choose to by, through using the internet as a bridge. The question then is, how do we find a way forward that takes this as a given and builds our understanding of what is going on in the world of letters right now and the world of ideas that encompasses what is really happening rather than perhaps what is only in print through large presses. Yeah.
Thanks, Alvin. David?
I suppose I'd only add to that the poetry reading scene is really alive and kicking and kicking people. And so I mean, I don't think that I access the poems that I most like through anthologies. I know that I don't. Where the poems that I find myself liking that I haven't come across before, someone will be on stage reading them or exclaiming them or something like that. So I guess the interest there is that the internet has been remarkable for poetry, but at the same time as it's kind of produced that virtual presence for poetry, poetry has asserted itself as a presence in all kinds of settings. Settings like this, and just reading series wherever you go. So I don't know. I think the anthology, people know how to bypass the gatekeepers, I suppose, is what I think. But.
Right. Ranjit?
No, I agree with everything that all three of you have said, but I remain troubled by, I think, the fairly undisputed fact that the anthology, a certain kind of anthology, remains for young people, for students at school, the first entry point, and it comes with an aura of authority. So whilst as practitioners we have access to these many, many different levels of access, I'm worried about how the canon is naturalized even before you realize it's a canon. So how do you then unmake those reflexes as you go along?
I think that's it's an important point. So, and completely, and I see this. You certainly see this in schools in the UK, that it's a very narrow understanding of what the 20th century poem is that gets presented, and I guess it's a fact that it's only a small minority of people will carry on reading sufficient to know that doesn't constitute. So for sure that's a worry. I agree.
Just to add to that, the pedagogy of literature and poetry in Singapore is interesting in finding ways around this. And one way that we've done it is through the power of the unseen poem section of the examinations. The wonderful thing about the unseen poem and obliging students to sort of come across a poem they've never seen before and then analyze it is that it is not bound by textbooks and anthologies. And teachers have been using that as a way to bring in work from all across the board, including that was actually the first way that Singaporean writing and poems entered the classroom, because we are never in any of the sort of anthologies that Cambridge offers, you see. And the first way that they could bring in work that was relevant and exciting and interesting to look at was through that. So there are, I think, ways. We have to find ways to empower our teachers to allow that to happen side by side with, I think, the more canonical work, so that at the very least, to begin with, some sort of dialogue, some sort of way to look at things you've never seen before. I think any education system needs to provide for that more generally.
Excellent. So let's open it up to the audience now, and if there are questions. Yes?
I just have statements for poets. These aren't really questions, it's just like you to respond to them. Aditi, the first one's for you. You can't write wandered lonely as a cloud anymore. Good writing is increasingly specified. You have to say whether it's a cirrus or a cumulus. This one's for Ranjit. I also think this way. I think poetry is taught badly, not just because the teachers don't know how to teach it, but it's also that the philosophy aspect of, like, through lit theory, etc., in English departments, they carry that momentum towards rationality for people, and that's why its practicality is favored over poetry, which does not have any utilitarian usage in that utilitarian sense anymore. So I'd like you to respond to that. And this is for Alvin. Poets have their own universe of symbols, but everyone doesn't become a semiotician.
I love how I become the voice for all conversations about sexuality.
I didn't say it specifically about that. You know.
But if I understand, then what we're saying is that just writing what you feel without putting in more meaning into what you're writing. If that's what you're saying, that you can't write, you need to add the weightage to what you're writing, which is what I was thinking when we were speaking about the cultural crossroads bit, was that what qualifies as a good poem by, say, a poet from Singapore, or a poet from Trivandrum writing in English. That we write culture into the poem as well. We pepper it with local words, sounds, to also qualify as somebody who's writing from this location. Because I think in fiction, at least, that's a conversation that you write a certain short story or a certain story in a certain way because it's more exotic then. So do we also write, probably, a response could be this, that we actually are putting in different flavors extremely consciously, because that also says a lot about, what's my location as a poet and how textured my writing then becomes.
About the problems with teaching poetry, right? Okay. If I understood you correctly, Medha, I think, did you indicate that on the one hand, there's a problem of teaching poetry in a kind of in a way that flattens it, and on the other hand, a far more academic way that reduces the poem to a text for further analysis? Is that what you were saying?
Yeah, in a sense. My whole, the point here is about how much a certain aspect of teaching, how much rationality is given weightage, and whether novels and lit theory can kind of adhere to that, and poetry resists it. I mean,
my appeal was not to bring on the machinery of literary theory at school level at all. That is a loss of innocence that can wait for a slightly later date. But all I'm saying is that, as I remember it, I've been away from school very long. Sorry about that. My impression is that poetry is a problem of rationality. I think the thrum and tenor of education is to instrumentalize its subjects. And there's still, I think, a persistent notion of the so-called hard disciplines versus the so-called soft disciplines. So we're all the soft wallas. So poetry tends to be just mined for some kind of single order meaning, and the text tends to get isolated from its context. So all I'm saying is that you could teach poetry at school level in a way that's far more amplified, that places it in its historical contexts, that parses it and opens and demonstrates the multidimensionality of a poetic text and how it belongs. Because I think the other way of doing it, the lit theory machinery, is equally brutal. It also instrumentalizes the text in a different kind of way. So that's not what I'm asking for.
Yes, I think David, I mean, who's also a professor, so.
Yeah, so I don't teach in a school, I teach in a university. And I think things are changing for the worse in that context, at least the context I teach in. So I think previously it's been the case that one could precisely teach poetry as a kind of form of resistance to rationality, and one could teach whatever one wanted, and one had freedoms of choices and all kinds of things. One still has those notional freedoms of choice within the syllabus, but as universities become increasingly monetized, and represented straightforwardly by the huge cost of going to a university, then a different kind of question inevitably bears down. It's not the question that is at the forefront of one's mind when one is deciding which poems to teach, but somewhere in the student's mind, the question is, how does this deliver for me? And that's really a worry, and that's a worry that we're going to be living with for some time now, I think.
That's precisely my point, because I know I was talking to some students at school and they were asking me, why should we study English literature when we have the choice to do philosophy, because that will leave doors open for us to do law or sociology later on if we choose to. And so, I mean, like you mentioned, English literature is we are the soft discipline people. I don't like how this is progressing. I don't like how philosophy at some point started being given preference over literature.
I would only say that some of my favorite lawyers did English. That's all I would say on that point, I think. I mean, it's perfectly possible, but...
I mean, I'm actually, on the one hand, you see, instead of poetry enriching and humanizing the marketplace is in a sense invading and occupying the space of, determining what we read and so on. However, I also see back home in Singapore a very interesting phenomenon in my generation of people who aren't full-time writers, who are lawyers and novelists, medical doctors and poets, so on and so forth. In fact, that's the norm where I come from. And what is happening is you have people who are insisting upon professional rigor and so on and so forth, but also refusing to turn away from the values that we sort of celebrate and espouse and express through poetry. They see them as coherent and cogent. They see them as part of what being a full, civilized, responsible human being is. And I say more power to them. That is the kind of model, I think, that I would hope we aspire to, rather than any sort of imaginary purity, so on and so forth.
I think we have time for one more question. Oh yes, the young gentleman here. And it's nice to see this bunch. Which school are you from? Sorry, Lekol Champakan.
We're from Lekol Champakan International. So yeah, this is just an open question for all the four of you. So all four of you touched upon the fact that the teaching of poetry and prose in schools, it's in a bad level. So do you think that this is due to a decades-old notion that children don't want anything to do with poetry and literature and they just find it as an act of boredom? Do you think that is why the level of teaching is at a very low level than the other subjects that were being taught in schools?
Are your teachers here?
Yeah, two of them.
Yeah, who'd like to take that? Yeah, sure.
I come from a country whose founding father, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, late Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, once said famously that poetry is a luxury that we cannot afford, right? So a lot has to do with, I think, the histories of our societies and countries. We were poor for a very long time. In some ways, many people are still at a point where they struggle for their daily meal. And there was a point in time where that was the priority. And you have very intelligent, well-read men and women, the leaders at the time, recognizing that there were certain things that needed to be done to put food on the table first. The problem, however, is that habit, I think, has in some cases become entrenched, so that we forget that the idea is not to keep doing that. Once you have food on the table, you move on to other things, and we look after each other, we develop compassion, we develop a sense of broader things, and so on. I think the habit stuck, and in some people, we're sort of stuck in survival mode, and that lends itself to a certain sort of, very conveniently to the sort of neoliberal habit of mechanizing and sort of putting a price on everything?
I don't think, I'm not convinced that the issue is that the teaching is bad. And I certainly know, some exceptional high school teachers who are working really hard to open poetry up. I think the curricula are bad. And certainly in the UK, in a way that I haven't seen before, the curriculum is now centralized between the ages of 11 and 16 or 11 and 18. It's centralized in a way that it wasn't before. A recent education minister, I won't trouble you with his name, decided that the syllabus for people taking an exam at 16 should feature only British literature. As opposed to, for instance, American literature. I mean, only as opposed to American literature. So these are tremendous exclusions. That's very damaging in the ways that Ranjit was saying before. I think the only solace one can take from that is that there is that guy was an English student. Jeez. But the solace one can take from that is that there is actually implicit in that an understanding of the dangers, the exciting dangers that are provoked when literature is really opened up. That is understood by the curriculum, which is why it doesn't open it up. So it's a problem, but also the problem is recognizing a virtue of literature that we just have to keep referring to, I suppose.
Just a quick point about danger. One of the interesting things that's happening among young writers in Singapore, many of whom didn't study literature in school. They discovered poetry as a dangerous thing on the side. Precisely because it's not official and boring and from the classroom, they were drawn to it. So, there's the argument that stuff that is sort of poo-pooed on officially is precisely the things that will draw you. So we have a joke, the best way to make people read a book is to ban it.
All right, so thank you very much for being such an engaging audience. It was lovely talking to all of you. Thank you for being here, and have a great day ahead.